Many of today's scientists are finding holes in it. This is the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Its fossil collection is seen by some scientists as challenging Darwin's theory of evolution. And Professor Jeffrey Schwartz is a scientist who is turning Darwinism on its head. You might think he's a member of the evangelical religious right, but he's actually an agnostic.
Here we see
Schwartz says the fossil record suggests that species can appear suddenly.
What's interesting is that if we look at this specimen here, this is actually a cast of the most famous specimen, the first specimen of Archaeopteryx.
Yes.
And this has some features of dinosaur kind of things, if you will. It has toothed jaws. You can't see it in here. It still had teeth. You can see the feathers. So Darwin used Archaeopteryx as an example of an intermediate, something that's between reptiles and birds. Others said, no, this is just there, you know, popped out of nowhere. So the thing is that intermediate is really in the eye of the beholder. And
Schwartz uses a modern understanding of genes to explain how new features, or novelties, appear suddenly as opposed to through gradual evolution.
The theory that I proposed is that a so-called mutation in the broadest sense arises usually in the unexpressed or recessive state. And in modern biological language, we would say inactive. Spreads silently through the population until you have individuals with a copy of this novel potential for novelty, and then they produce offspring that has both copies. Boom, you get it.
You get it.
So
within one generation?
Yes. The spread of the potential for novelty may take several generations. The appearance of the novelty is like that. An hour from West Virginia.
The dramatic point about the good professor's theory is that Darwin can only explain how novelty evolves, not where it originates from. The same applies to entire species.
You could rewrite Darwin's most famous work on the origin of adaptation by means of natural selection. The Darwinian theory is that selection causes the feature to appear. But in fact, a feature can only have selection act on it once it appears.
How long do you think it'll take before Darwin is actually comprehensively rewritten and it is accepted as such?
That's an interesting question. It could be rather rapidly, but there are people in geology.
Professor Schwartz's theories, of course, do not imply the existence of a divine creator, but they do rip at the heart of those evolutionists who use Darwinist theory to explain everything very simply as a gradual procession with a purpose. I'm pretty sure that sooner or later Darwin's theory will be superseded. Science is a wonderful human creation for explaining the world, but it is almost always incomplete. Its theories, which were once considered pure fact, revised or discarded. It's known as paradigm shift.
One of the most fascinating things about the history of science is the idea of the paradigm shift. That scientists thought in one way, and then the force of evidence came to a point where they were forced to review things radically and start seeing things in a very different direction.
The fact that science keeps changing means that its conclusions can never be absolutely certain. But what is important to atheists is not the conclusions, but the scientific method.
Science does not know everything now.
It doesn't know everything, but it's got an extraordinarily potent method, and everything it touches gives way. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing about science. You identify a problem, you bring the scientific method to bear on it, and it crumbles in front of your approach. It's a wonderful method, and humanity should be proud that it stumbled on a technique for discovering the truth. For 3,000 years, it thought it had a method of getting the truth, and it called it religion. But, you know, that's obviously impotent as a way of discovering anything about the world.
But the past has shown that the tools of the scientific method, logic, reason and evidence, don't always lead to a better world. In 1865, Darwin's half-cousin, Francis Galton, took the logical step and applied Darwin's theory of natural selection to human beings. Using logic and reason, Galton came up with a theory called eugenics, and the results were a bit worrying.
Galton's career is unimaginable without Darwin's work for seed. He's directly inspired by The Origin of Species, and he's directly inspired because Darwin clearly implies that the theory applies to humans as much as it does to the animal and plant kingdom. And the problem is this, is that although evolution proceeds by natural selection, civilized society, civilization, negates natural selection. So Darwin says...
How does it?
Well, the sick, the lame, the feeble-minded, says Darwin, are protected in civilised society. And so Galton and eugenics is the solution to that, if you like. It's saying...
Which is not to care about them.
Not necessarily not to care about them, but certainly to restrict their breeding. Because otherwise, and Darwin explicitly recognises this in The Descent of Man, there's a danger that the unfit will outbreed the fit. And natural selection and the evolutionary process will go into reverse.
Galton tried to develop scientific techniques to identify the unwanted in society by their physical traits.
What he did is he went around collecting photographs of various types of criminals in the hope of being able to discover common physical traits between them.
And what are these photographs of?
These are the various different categories of criminal.
Of criminal?
He did this for racial groups as well. In 1885 he does a study of Jewish boys.
One chap who found such ideas particularly compelling was Adolf Hitler. David Stack runs a course called From Darwin to Death Camps. He believes the Nazis took Galton's ideas one step further, using them to justify the extermination of Jews.
Is there a direct line between Darwin, Galton and Hitler?
There's a direct line. Is Darwin responsible for what happens under the Nazis? No. Is there an intellectual connection? Then yes. Darwin removes the spirituality of mankind. He places man within nature. Once you do that, then you can begin to regard man as you regard animals and as you regard the plant kingdom.
You'll find very few good-minded liberal atheists arguing the case for eugenics these days. But why not? What's the matter, boys? Scientifically, it is, after all, very difficult to argue against. But something stops us clamouring for the compulsory sterilisation of mentally handicapped people. Something perhaps unscientific. That something is called morality. The fact that atheists have to confront is a terrible one. The scientific method is, by definition, supposedly disinterested and neutral. So, if you rely on science to tell you how to live your life, where do you look for moral guidance? Natural selection and survival of the fittest are the only moral imperatives that can be adduced from Darwinism. Unsurprisingly, not many atheists fancy that approach to morality. And so atheism's big thinkers are working hard to find a moral code that is based on reason. Peter Singer is one of atheism's greatest ethical philosophers.
Lovely tuning. Where do you think we derive ethics from?
I think essentially we get ethics when we take a wider point of view, when we don't just think of our own selfish interests, but when we think of the interests of a larger group. So we're sort of putting ourselves in the position of taking an impartial view as to what should or shouldn't be done.
Your view of ethics presumably means a moral code which necessarily changes.
The overall moral principle that says you should do what has the best consequences never changes. But, of course, in different circumstances, a particular action will have different consequences.
But doesn't that lead to a moral vacuum?
No, I don't think it leads to a moral vacuum. I think it leads to a more reflective morality, one that is held perhaps in a somewhat more tentative way.
A tentative morality is also what we find in Richard Dawkins' latest entertaining excursion into religion bashing, The God Delusion. In it, Dawkins kindly comes up with his own new set of 10